see where you're all coming from. We have representation, I think, from all over the world. So very, very exciting here. So I'm going to just share my screen with you. And what you're going to be seeing is a Nearpod code. Now, Nearpod is limited to 250 participants, so I don't need you all jumping in, but anybody who would like to join in, please do. If you do not get into Nearpod, no worries. You'll be able to see absolutely everything we do through through the meeting channel here. But those of you who want to join, please join. You'll be able to engage a little bit. And those of you who are unable to join in Nearpod, no worries. Once again, you'll be able to see everything. And we'll use the chat box to engage as well. So if you want to join, you can go to join.nearpod.com, and then you would just be prompted to put in this code. So I'm going to click this off, but those of you who are still interested in joining the Nearpod, it doesn't go away. It's staying up there in our upper left-hand corner. So today I'm very excited to talk about EAP and critical thinking, and specifically assessment. So let's just get started right off the bat. Something that I might do in my own classes is just show an image like this and ask students what happened and what is going to happen next. Okay, what happened and what's going to happen next. So you can share your thoughts here if you're in Nearpod on the collaborative board. If you're not in Nearpod, you can share your thoughts there in our chat box. But this is a little critical thinking activity to get us really thinking about critical thinking and get us back into the mindset of what critical thinking is. So he's going to be fired perhaps to something that's going to be something that's next. He had an argument. He was talking on the phone angrily. He's going to slam the phone down. He received a call from an unpaid debt. Okay, he lost $1 million deal. Excellent. So all of these are examples of us using our critical thinking skills. Okay, using our critical thinking skills. Thinking about what's not there, right? What's not there. And that's what critical thinking has a lot to do with, looking at what's not there. And critical thinking goes beyond looking at the language. So we're not just looking at the language and the language our students use, but we're also thinking about how they think. So how can we weigh, how can we measure how someone thinks? And really that is the gist of our webinar today. So just to do a little recap, if you haven't been with me the last two webinars, we talked about originally what is critical thinking. And I give you this definition. That's really a complex process that involves reflection, analysis, and evaluation. And for me and many others, it's also an ideology. So it's a belief system. It's part of my teaching toolkit. So just as I believe I need to get students in groups, or I need to get them being productive with the language, I also have a belief system that I need to get them to think critically, okay, to reflect, to analyze, to evaluate. So it's part of my teaching toolkit. And it goes beyond those cognitive domains. So not just linguistically, not just getting students to use the language, but includes those affective domains as well. How are they interacting with others? How are they representing maybe what their group believes or what their group says? And then putting in that cultural knowledge of that target learning environment. What are the expectations of that target learning environment? So if your students are coming to the US or the UK or Canada to study, what are the expectations in those environments? And I also share with you a recipe for success. So, putting together that cognitive literacy, that language development with that affective literacy, how to behave as a student. What does it mean to collaborate? How do you respond effectively? And then that cultural knowledge of the expectation. When we put these three things together, that's really a recipe for success, for successful development of critical thinking. Okay. And then our last webinar, we talked about some great classroom activities. I shared some of my activities with you, but many of you also shared activities with me as well. So we talked about, statements that agree and disagree, categorizing, identifying problems, using graphic organizers, using circles of possibility, having students present information from various perspectives, students deducing the rules, students taking a stance. We talked about facts and opinions, evaluating sources, reading between the lines, having students write headlines, and then tasks and project-based learning. All of these kinds of activities can really build students' critical thinking. We talked about some guiding principles too, which I think it's important to touch base on these before we dive deep into assessment. So students need to engage in critical thinking at all levels beyond examples. And, categorizing is a great one because you can use images at those very early language levels. It's also important to really provide a space. There needs to be a deliberate set time in which students engage in critical thinking activities. And practices need to be spiraled throughout the course. And when they're spiraled, they're revisited, but they're revisited and building in complexity every time. And students must practice transferring critical thinking skills to other contexts as well. So let's take a poll. So those of you who are with me here through the Nearpod, you can answer on Nearpod. If you're not, go ahead and please answer in the chat box. But tell me if you think this is a fact or a myth, that critical thinking is impossible to assess. So I'll give you a minute here. Is this a fact or a myth? So I'm seeing in the chat box, lots of myths. Possible, some of you are saying in the chat box there. And I'm seeing many of you here also stating it's a myth. A couple here with a fact as well. Okay. So let's look at this. It's actually a myth. Critical thinking can be assessed, and it should be assessed. And when we talk about assessment, we'll talk about formal assessment and informal assessment. But critical thinking is something that is measurable, okay? And hopefully by the end of the webinar today, you'll see how it is measurable. So let's try another one. Where language is limited, critical thinking cannot be assessed. So not just thinking about critical thinking in general, but specifically with limited language. Think about our level zeros or our pre-level ones, our pre-beginners. What do we think? Is this a fact or a myth? And I'm seeing lots of myths here, and in the chat box, some myths and some facts there. Okay, so let's look at this one. It is also a myth, okay? And my little line through the equal sign is a little off there, I apologize. But in classes where language is limited, it is possible to assess critical thinking. And we have to separate proficiency and critical thinking. Okay, students can think critically without demonstrating proficiency in a language, okay? And hopefully, again, at the end of the webinar, we'll see this in action as well, okay? Here's another one, myth or fact. When we attempt to assess critical thinking, it's near impossible to distinguish if language or critical thinking has gaps. So when we do assess critical thinking, it's really hard as educators to distinguish between language and critical thinking, and if the gap is related to language or related to critical thinking. So give me your ideas here, myth or fact? Okay, so from our chat box, I'm getting myth, I'm getting some possibly true as well. And here it's a little more, I'm showing a few more myths and a few more facts than we did before. And so for sake of time, let's look at this one. This is also a myth, okay? Now, why is it a myth? We need to thoughtfully construct assessments to ensure that they are measuring exactly what we are attempting to measure, okay? And I think this is one of the hardest things for language teachers, the blur between measuring language and measuring critical thinking, okay? I for my own classes, these have to be very separate in how I measure them. Okay, very, very separate in how I measure them. And once again, hopefully at the end of the webinar, we'll all have a better answer to this. Here's another one, myth or fact. True assessment of critical thinking only happens when our students leave our EAP courses. And EAP, I'm thinking about English for academic purposes here, and when students go into maybe their academic discipline in English. Okay, so critical thinking only happens when our students leave our EAP classes. So fact or myth, what do we think? Okay, so here in Nearpod, I'm seeing more myths, and I'm also seeing many more myths in our chat boxes as well. And this also is a myth. Our students need to arrive in their academic courses with critical thinking skills, okay? We cannot count on them being developed when they're in their academic discipline courses. It's something that we really need to build and develop. I like to think of critical thinking as part of the culture that we teach in the classroom. Just as if we teach information about maybe specific, English speaking holidays, for example. Critical thinking is a really huge part of our academic coursework. And so part of what we need to teach students while they're with us is that critical thinking. And here's the last one. Assessments that measure critical thinking focus on the product or final production task. So thinking about how we can shape assessments. Do those assessments focus only on the product and final production task? Is that a myth or a fact? Okay, so I'm seeing in our Nearpod many myths, and I'm seeing, okay, I see a great comment in our chat box here that the process is critical. And yes, this is a myth, okay? The process is just as important as the final product, or even more important when we talk about critical thinking. So valid and reliable assessments should keep a balance between process and product. The how, not just the what. Okay, so many times in language, we focus on the end result, that product. But the how in critical thinking is just as important as that end product. Okay, so let's get started and really dive deep into assessment. So how can we assess how students think? Because that's really what critical thinking is. It's about how a student thinks. And here, it's really about how they know rather than what they know. Okay, so let's just, unpack that for a second. How they know, how they know. So how did they get to that point? What was that process once again? So really, again, focusing on that process, focusing on the how they know. And when we think about the assessment, we really have to think about two kinds of assessment here. Okay, we have to think about formal assessment, and those might be our teacher designed exams or publisher designed exams that measure our student learning outcomes. And those formal assessments are really important, right? We know that, okay? They're important for all kinds of reasons, but they really, they show the learning that happens, right, in the end. But just as important, if not more important, when we think about critical thinking, we think about those informal assessments, those on the spot interactions. Okay, so when we think about measuring critical thinking, there needs to be a true balance between that informal and formal. Okay, and once again, it's about that process for critical thinking. So we need to assess after conducting teaching and learning process. So we constantly need to, formulate questions on the spot that can show us a student's understanding, not just of the language, but perhaps of that process as well. So when we think about the critical thinking assessment, we have to think about the framework. And when I say framework, this is the foundation of how we would develop any assessment, whether it's formal or informal, when it comes to critical thinking. And so really it comes down to two things. We can really break it down in two ways: analysis and synthesis. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the analysis. So are students able to evaluate things? Can they show what belongs to a certain group? Can they identify relationships that have not been identified for them? Can they identify the source and maybe even the reliability and validity of a source? Can they identify an argument that is not clearly stated? Can they show relevance between things that maybe do not look as though they are connected or related? All of these things are analyzing, right? And so if we practice activities like this in the classroom, when we assess this, we're going to be looking at these kinds of things. The second part of that framework is synthesis, okay? And now, different from analysis, looking at that one thing and analyzing it. But synthesis, are we able to take that a step further? Can they understand implications and consequences? Can they draw a conclusion? So many of you did that when I showed you that very first image, okay? I remember somebody posted on the board, he just lost $1 million deal. Okay, so you were able to draw a conclusion from that. Are we able to make inferences? Can we deduce additional meaning, okay, from what we see? And is there effective reasoning? So as we move through talking about assessment, analysis, and then synthesis, okay? Analysis really focusing on that evaluation, and synthesis really understanding beyond what's there, beyond what's there. So I'm going to break this down by our skill areas. And first we'll focus a little bit on those receptive skills, reading and listening. Okay, so generally in reading and listening, we want students to understand the text. We want them to be able to identify the main ideas and supporting ideas. But the next step when we talk about critical thinking is we want them to engage with the text. And what does that mean? We want them to connect the text to themselves. We want them to connect the text to the world. We want them to be able to see implications of the text, okay? And really that orange box is the one in which we are building that critical thinking. So obviously understanding main ideas and supporting ideas, if we're assessing, we're really assessing language, right? We're really assessing, do they understand the structure? Do they understand the vocabulary to be able to get the main ideas? But when we get to that orange box, what we're assessing there is critical thinking. Are they able to make a connection to the text? Can they make an implication based on the information in the text? And so when we think about creating assessments, we want to create very linear assessments in the way that we separate the main ideas and supporting ideas, and that those critical thinking tasks as connecting to the self, world, and any implications. So, formally and informally, Obviously, when we read, we do this all the time. Informally, we might ask students to look at a picture and make predictions. Okay. We might ask some inferencing questions. We might ask them to make connections within and outside the text to additional resources. So when we're doing these things, we're essentially assessing their critical thinking. Okay. Now these can be done formally and informally, right? As a whole class, I can show a picture and have the students make predictions what the text is going to be about. But it can also happen in a traditional assessment as well. So when creating those formal assessments, okay, as I mentioned, those traditional assessments, we really want to focus on Bloom's verbs. These are measurable verbs, okay? And we really want to focus on stages 4, 5, and 6, the analysis, the synthesis, and the evaluation. So using these verbs on a rubric are really going to help me assess a student's critical thinking, okay? Were they able to reconstruct the story? Were they able to rearrange maybe events in the listening they heard? Okay. Could they choose one side of the listening and defend that side? So using these verbs in my rubric will really help me create a very thoughtful assessment that is separating language and critical thinking. Okay, so here, 1, 2, and 3, this is really just assessing my language, right? Knowledge, okay? And a simple rubric like this, yes or no. Did my students were able to answer the who question? Yes. Were my students able to answer the what question? Yes. Were my students able to answer the where question? Yes. This is assessment of language, right? But when I go back to the other one, okay, 4, 5, and 6, I'm really, if I frame these questions, I can really assess the critical thinking. So separating out the critical thinking and the language is very important. So here's an example of a focus on 4, 5, and 6. Now this one is measuring critical thinking. Okay, so here with the evaluation, were my students able to agree and disagree and give a reason? Okay, that's a measurement of critical thinking. Can they express their thoughts and support their ideas? Again, a measure of critical thinking. And can they express what is most important, but why? Okay, again, here I'm measuring critical thinking. So I can't say it enough. It's really important when we're designing these kinds of rubrics that we want to separate out our language and our critical thinking. Okay, we want to separate that out when we're measuring critical thinking. And informally, these can be done in a group. I could have a group discussion. I've even done this where I've had one group work together and they do the discussion in front of the rest of the class, and the other group members, the other class members, excuse me, have a checklist and they're answering who made an inference, who supplied a logical reason for another student's idea, who made a comparison, who drew a conclusion. Okay, and these kinds of discussions can happen face to face, or they can happen virtually with online discussion boards. Okay, and I think it's great to use those online discussion boards because you have a history there, right? You have some historical information that you can show, okay, this is the kind of comparison I'm looking for, or this is the kind of conclusion I'm looking for. So those are great to use in the classroom, especially in our COVID world here. But how about those receptive skills? How about the writing and speaking? Okay, so obviously writing and the rhetorical modes we teach, like compare, contrast, cause and effect, these really lend themselves to critical thinking. By themselves, they're naturally critical thinking developers, right? But the assessment then needs to identify the language skills and the critical thinking skills. So once again, really thoughtfully separating these out on a rubric. But more importantly, when we talk about writing and critical thinking, we have to give some attention to the process from ideation to drafting. Okay. What was that process the student was following? So here's an example where we focus not only on Bloom's product verbs, but also on some process verbs. Okay, so the process shows an ability to examine all sides, to make meaningful connections, to look at a variety of options. And on this rubric, if we go all the way down, we see the least amount of points here for limited exploration, and little attention is given to others. Okay, so this again is following on the process, right? Not that final end product, but the process the student went to get to that final product. And I think that's really important when we think about writing. Okay, getting students to think about that whole process and think through things. It's the same, for speaking and critical thinking. I know many of us use the traditional debates and other kinds of speaking tasks that really, naturally build in critical thinking. But it's important in the way we ask questions when we're asking students to speak. So, I try to avoid things like, what are the advantages and disadvantages, right? Because those are very, very clear cut, and students can often open up a textbook and find the advantages and disadvantages of something. But imagine if we ask the question, which of these ideas is the strongest? Which is the weakest? And why? Now, students have to go beyond what's in the text. And it really allows students to consider the context of the question. So, which ideas, if I'm talking about environmental awareness and things we can do to save the environment, not only am I going to talk, obviously there are advantages to this and disadvantages to this, but which one of those is the strongest? Okay. And the context becomes important. Which one of those is the strongest for today? Which one of these is the strongest possibly for 10 years from now or for 20 years from now? So now what's happening is students have to think more critically through that situation, right? It's not a simple list of these are the advantages, these are the disadvantages. And it's important, I think, to consider building in assessments of group dynamics, right? Giving students sentence framers for interrupting and clarifying and making a connection between speakers, and building upon others' ideas. So, I have my students a lot get in groups and practice being in groups. They're going to be going into the American educational system in which they're going to be doing a lot of group work. And so I'll give students, you're the student who's going to interrupt. You're the student who's going to clarify. You're the student who's going to make a connection between the speakers, and give them an opportunity to practice that and assess them in those areas as well. And again, using a rubric. And when we talk about rubrics, our rubrics, again, I can't say enough, but they do need to separate the language skills and the critical thinking skills, right? And our rubrics, when we think about critical thinking, should accurately, have things like interpret the evidence, analyze and evaluate key information, draw responsible conclusions, justify inferences, explain assumption and reasons, okay? And if you go back to some of those Bloom's verbs at stages 4, 5, and 6, you'll see these exact verbs there. And it's important, some tips for creating these rubric is really keep your rubric short and concise. Okay. I've seen a lot of rubrics that get very, very lengthy. And, as a teacher, I have a hard time understanding them. So could you imagine how our students feel when they get this rubric? So make sure your rubric is at the level of your learners. It's also important to use 2 or 3 short, clear sentences rather than one long sentence with, 2 or 3 clauses in them. The rubric is not so much for us as for the student. And I think we lose sight of that a little bit, right? Because it's to guide the student to be successful in that, whatever that endeavor might be, but it also provides the student with feedback, right? And if the student can't understand where the gaps are, then they can't improve in those areas. So really, 2 to 3 short, clear sentences rather than one really long sentence. And I think it's important to use the same rubric for the same exercise type. Getting students familiar with the rubric and the expectations that go along with that rubric. And then we think about, those productive skills overall, whether it's speaking or writing. Self-assessment, I don't think gets enough credit when we think about our language classes. When students self-assess, they're naturally thinking critically, okay? And self-assessment could be as easy as, I was able to select a topic for this writing assignment, or I had trouble selecting a topic for this writing assignment. I found it easy to make a connection between X and Y. So, getting students to really self-assess. Now, these self-assessments are, not related to their grade, but they're definitely related to their critical thinking. And it can give you insight into where they're struggling with their critical thinking. Okay, so when it comes to those productive skills, self-assessment also very critical. And when we talk about integrated skills and critical thinking, many of us do not separate necessarily, the writing from the speaking, from the reading, from the listening. And so a great way, and I've talked about, some of the activities that you can do last webinar, but problem and project-based learning. Okay, and if we're really going with critical thinking, we're going to be working more towards problem-based learning. And problem-based learning is the one in orange, right? Where students determine the problem that has to be solved, okay? Versus project-based learning, where the teacher's really defining the problem. But in both of these cases, students guide their own learning, right? And there's real-world application, and learning process is very active. It's integrating, and I left this one off for some reason, but it's integrating all those skill areas, right? Students have to read, they have to listen, they have to speak, they have to write something. And so when we're assessing these kinds of things, well, first let's talk a little bit about the process here. So, begin with a problem and something is going to be solved. So when I assess it, can the problem be clearly identified? Were students able to identify that problem? Okay. Again, this speaks to critical thinking more so than language. Now they're using language, obviously to identify the problem, but was it clearly identified? The development of potential solutions, thinking about beyond one. Okay, so were they able to analyze each of those solutions and determine which one was the best solution and identify the why it was the best solution? And then focusing on one solution, again, were they able to identify why it was better than others? Could they support their ideas? So building a rubric around problem-based, obviously, these really lend themselves to that critical thinking piece. So here's a snapshot of a little rubric. Again, focusing on process and product, focusing on language and critical thinking. And again, separating language and critical thinking out. So the problem evaluation, and this is, students had to do a digital product. So they discuss the problem and they present clear and convincing research-based solutions. That's where all the points are. If we slide down to the end, that the digital product omits a discussion of the problem and any accompanying solutions. But then on a separate line, we have the style, grammar, and creativity. Okay, so again, separating out the critical thinking and the language, but also taking into consideration the process as well as the product. So to summarize here, assessing critical thinking happens in two ways. It happens both formally and informally. And when we assess critical thinking, we really need to consider final product, but we also need to consider that process. And assessing critical thinking really requires carefully designed rubrics that differentiate language skills and metacognition, those critical thinking skills, okay? So, it can happen. It can happen very successfully. It can happen formally and informally. But we really need to really develop these well-defined rubrics so we can differentiate these. Okay, so I believe we have some time for questions. I know there's another webinar coming up, so I think we'll have a little bit of time for questions.
Yes, thank you, Christina. Thank you for taking us through assessment and evaluation and separating out language from critical thinking itself. We have had some messages, by the way, of poor connection that people have been experiencing on their internet. If that is the case, the webinar is recorded and will be available on our website on pearsonenglish.com/experiences. So yes, as Christina said, if you do have questions on assessing critical thinking, please can you put them into the chat? We've had a question about certificates. Yes, certificates will be sent out within 2 weeks of today. I can't see any questions so far, although it's streaming through very quickly, Christina.
Yeah, I did see one related to writing. So how can you build critical thinking in writing? And again, I think it's built around the writing tasks that the students are doing, right? And this goes from very early levels of EAP courses to our more advanced levels. Even getting students in early levels to write an opinion and giving the why of their opinion, that can build critical thinking at a very low language skill. And then if we're talking about those upper levels, getting students to evaluate others' writing and maybe not their peers in the class, but maybe bringing in a newspaper article or something where they can take a stance and they can support their ideas in writing and justify as to why they're taking that stance. I think then that builds critical thinking in writing. And I saw another one pop up about my slides and sharing all of that. And Richard, correct me if I'm wrong, it's all up on your site there.
The recordings are, but we haven't made the slides available yet, but we will do. One of the question that's I've seen is, can you give us an example of a problem-based task that went particularly well?
I'm sorry, did you say a project-based task?
A problem-based task.
Oh, a problem-based task, yeah. So, I use a lot of things that relate to my college or university, right? And so for a while they had closed the cafeteria. And so students were struggling with where they can get food from, okay? So I gave that problem to the students to solve, okay? What do you think we should present to the administration? So I think the most successful problem-based tests that I've used in my classes have been ones that were really real to the students, things that hit them hard that they could understand. Okay, so not being able to get lunch midday was a real problem for them. So having them come up with a solution that was going to be real for them was the most meaningful. And it actually also elicited the most critical thinking, I think, as well as the most language. So I think making it really real and relevant to your students.
I think that answers one or two of the other questions around motivation as well. And one question we've had on assessment, today's topic is, how do we assess critical thinking in a short timed class? I guess, when you only have a short amount of time.
Yeah, I think, in those, I teach a class that's 50 minutes myself, and it's a very short period of time. And I think, you're informally constantly assessing, right? And it's a little harder in a Zoom world when you can't see your students' faces. But, following up afterwards, whether it's a virtual discussion board, getting students to post on that discussion board. So ending the class with some kind of, final thought and getting students to respond, but not just, again, it's how we ask the questions. It's not what are the advantages or disadvantages, but what is the strongest point and why? Okay. Or what was the weakest point and why? So again, I think it's maybe about reframing the questions we ask, whether they're informal question or informal assessment in the classroom or after the class, and using some of the digital tools that we have.
Looking at, so there's a question that's coming around low-level learners, and perhaps just turning this into the context of assessment particularly. If the students are A1 level, can they use their L1?
Well, I'm teaching a class that's mixed. Okay. So they're not all going to have the same first language. And so for me, that hasn't been a realistic option. I think if you're teaching a true bilingual class, then there are definite advantages for students using their L1. In an EAP situation, I think there's probably more disadvantages, especially if they're living in that target environment. But I guess it depends really on your actual class and where you're delivering the class and all of that. I think there's a lot that can be done at level 1. Getting students to, using images at those very early level of language development can really help build critical thinking.
Thank you. The question around assessment here is, how do you assess critical thinking when a group competition is going on? I guess that can depend a lot.
Right. Yeah. I think that depends what the competition is. I use Nearpod as we were using here. I use it a lot in my class because there's something in there called time to climb, which is a gamification. It's a competition. And again, I think it's how you frame the question. Okay. So, and asking yourself, am I assessing language or am I assessing critical thinking? And again, it becomes very blurry for many of us, but we have to really separate these out, whether we're doing some kind of gamification in the class or we're doing some other kind of task. But really thinking about how we ask the questions and asking ourselves, what am I truly assessing here? And, I don't believe we have to assess critical thinking all the time, right? There are times where we're just going to be assessing the language.
Thank you. This is a more general question, but again, perhaps can relate to assessment. Would you say that the why is more important than what when focusing on critical thinking?
Definitely. And it's why. It's always the why, right? Students can say yes or no quite easily, but following it up with giving me a reason, that's where critical thinking really comes into. So it's also, the difference between the how they think and not what they think, but how they process that, how they get to that end result.
Thank you. I think with that, I just think we have lots of questions coming, but so many that I'm just trying to find some relevant ones for now. I think we'll have time for one more question, and I'm afraid we have to finish off. Perhaps this is a more general question here. Students often do not like to think in the classroom. do you have any strategies to help prepare them for successful critical thinking work in the classroom?
I think that's such an interesting question. I think it's what our expectations are of the classroom. So, you know, I use a lot of, I really believe the flipped approach where I'll deliver lessons, you know, online, and students will have to watch videos or go through a task. And so they know when they come to class, there's going to be an expectation that they have to do. And that do involves that deep thinking. So I think it really goes to setting that expectation very early on. Okay. There's very little drill and kill during my class period, right? I want the drill and kill to take place at home when they don't need me. Okay. But I want that production to happen, that application to happen when they do need me. And so I think it's all about setting that expectation early on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christina. And thank you for a very informative talk today, which I think, judged by the comments, the attendees agree with. I'm sorry we're having to end it here. We do have lots of questions. The recording for this webinar will be on pearsonenglish.com/experiences. And people have asked about certificates. If you've signed in through Click Meeting, you'll get your certificate automatically by attending here. And similarly, if you're on Facebook, there's a form that you should fill in to get your your certificate for that too. But thanks again for everybody attending, but particularly thank you to Christina for taking us through EAP and critical thinking.
Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing everybody in 2 weeks. Bye.
Bye.